Hey, this is the 2014 AP Macro FRQ number 2. I think this is another good one to go over because it has a lot of questions related to monetary policy, which I think a lot of students are going to be weak on at this point. So we're starting off with a statement that the Federal Reserve can influence the supply of money. That's kind of obvious. We assume that the Federal Reserve targets a lower federal funds rate. Now, the federal funds rate, if you remember, will be the rate that banks charge each other for loans. What open market operation can the Fed use to achieve the lower target? So I would actually just draw a quick T-chart as a reminder of what we're looking at here. We've got assets and liabilities. And just a quick thought, we have an open market operation, and an open market operation by definition has to deal with the Fed buying or selling government treasury bonds. And so if we're looking at a bank T-chart, this is the commercial bank, your BB&T or whatever it might be, they have some bonds as assets, they have some cash, they have loans, including loans to all of us for cars and houses, but they also have loans between each other, and those are the federal funds rate. That would be the federal funds rate that we're talking about. So if we imagine, let's say that the government sells bonds. If the Fed decides to sell bonds, then banks would have more bonds. To pay for those bonds, they would have less cash. And if they have less cash, then they also would be making less loans to other banks. Well, that can't be the right answer, so let's scratch that out. They're not selling bonds. What if they were buying bonds? If they were buying bonds, then banks would have less bonds because they've sold their bonds to the Fed. That means that the Fed has given them cash, and with that cash, it's easier for them to then make loans to each other. And if it's easier for them to make loans to each other, we should see them dropping the rate that they're charging each other. So for the correct open market operation, the correct open market operation would be the Fed buys bonds. Period. The Fed buys bonds. Part 2, given your answer to the previous, what will happen to the price of government bonds? This is basically a supply and demand question. You don't need to draw it, but I'm just putting it in real quick. So we've got quantity and price for bonds. This would be a demand increase for bonds. The government is buying up bonds, and so if there's a demand increase, we see a higher price. So the price of government bonds goes up or increases. That's it. 2 points so far. This is asking for a graph of the money market. Obviously, we're not going to draw a money market graph on the 2020 exam because there's no graph drawing at all. But it does ask a question about the effect of this open market operation on nominal interest rates. And I think that question could still be in here without the requirement that we draw the graph, but we might still draw the graph just so we know what the right answer is. And so I'm going to draw on the graph real quick for the money market. The money market would be the quantity of money, and the price of money is the nominal interest rate. The supply of money is wherever the Federal Reserve decides to put it. Meanwhile, the demand for money is your typical demand curve. So we're just saying that if the Federal Reserve was buying bonds, then there is more money in the system. And so this is a supply increase for money. And if there was a supply increase for money, then our nominal interest rate has dropped by some amount. And so the question was asking for the graph. In 2020, we're not going to do the graph, but we probably needed to answer this question. And we would say nominal interest rates would go down. I assume on the 2020 exam, it's going to be worth just maybe like 1 point for that statement. On the 2014 test, this is worth 2 points for the graph and for the shift. Part C. We assume the Federal Reserve buys government bonds from commercial banks. That's what we'd said earlier, so we should have a good feeling about that. Based just on this transaction, will the level of required reserves in the commercial banks increase, decrease, or remain the same? This is a trick question. If the government buys bonds, then the bank has less bonds. They have more cash in reserves. However, even though they have more cash in reserves, their required reserves have not been changed in this problem. Their required reserves might be 10% or 15% or whatever it might be. And so the level of required reserves is not affected by any of these changes. Even though the reserves have gone up, the required reserves would still be the same. And so it's kind of a trick question. The required reserves remain the same. And that's worth 1 point. Lastly, they are just giving us a definition question. This is easy. Another monetary policy action involves changing the discount rate. Define the discount rate. And the discount rate is the rate that the Fed charges commercial banks for loans from the Fed. That's right. Banks can borrow directly from the Fed. When banks borrow directly from the Fed, that is the discount rate. And so defining the discount rate, it's the rate that the Fed charges commercial banks for loans from the Fed. That's it. And all that came to a 6-point question. I think in 2020, this would probably be more like a 5-point question because we won't have that graph. If you have any questions, please ask.